He watched the cameras find their focus, the red lights blinking to life one by one, like the eyes of predators awakening in the dark. A faint predatory smile touched the corner of Senator Mark Van Hollen's lips. He smoothed the lapel of his Savile Row suit, a piece of tailored armor for the battle to come. His aide leaned in, whispering final reassurances, but Van Hollen waved him off. The plan was perfect. The trap was set. He glanced across the cavernous hearing room, his gaze landing on the empty chair waiting for his target. "Let the populace burn," Van Hollen murmured the words of venomous prayer, meant only for himself. The cameras are waiting. The chamber itself was a monument to manufactured gravity, a cathedral of power built from cold marble and dark polished wood. The air was thick with the low hum of electronics and the scent of old paper and ambition. It was Van Hollen's arena. He understood its rhythms, its unspoken rules, its intricate choreography of power. He had designed this hearing not as an inquiry, but as a public execution. The narrative was simple: a reckless firebrand from Ohio. Senator JD Vance had latched onto a rogue prosecutor's flimsy investigation to launch a baseless attack on the sanctity of the federal judiciary. Van Hollen would be the voice of reason, the defender of institutions, the one who would calmly dismantle Vance's crusade on national television. It would be a masterclass in political theatre. The heavy oak doors at the side of the chamber swung open. JD Vance entered, and the atmosphere shifted. He wasn't a creature of this place, and it showed. His suit, while respectable, wasn't armor. It looked lived-in, earned. He didn't glide through the room with the practiced ease of a lifelong insider. He walked with a fighter's deliberate pace, his shoulders set, his eyes scanning the room not for allies, but for adversaries. For a fleeting second, his gaze drifted past the senators, past the reporters, as if looking through the marble walls themselves. In his mind's eye, a different picture formed: a shuttered factory in Middletown, Ohio. The tired faces of steelworkers at a diner. The quiet desperation of a town that had been promised everything and given nothing. He wasn't here for the game. He was here because they couldn't be. That was his inner strength, the bedrock of his resolve. He took his seat. Behind him, almost invisible to the casual observer, sat a woman who was the antithesis of the room's frantic energy, Pam Bondi. She was an island of calm, methodical focus. She arranged 3 thick, colour-coded binders on the small table behind Vance, her movements precise, economical, and devoid of emotion. She was the architect in the shadows, the silent quartermaster who had forged the weapons for the war to come. Vance didn't look back at her, but he felt her presence a steady grounding force, the fire and the ice. Chairwoman Judy Mason, a woman whose face was a mask of procedural neutrality, banged the gavel. The sound was a sharp crack in the tense silence. "This committee is now in session. We are here today to review the circumstances surrounding the recent detention of a sitting federal judge, Linda Dugan, and the unorthodox investigation that precipitated it." Her eyes flickered toward Vance. Van Hollen leaned into his microphone, his voice smooth as silk, but laced with condescension. "Thank you, Madam Chair." "Senator Vance," he began, not bothering to hide his disdain. "You've brought this chamber to a standstill with quite spectacular claims, turning a standard departmental audit into a national spectacle. Before we delve into the creative interpretations of fact provided by your source, Ms. Bondi, let's establish a baseline. Do you understand that by championing this inquiry, you are subverting established judicial oversight protocols and potentially setting a dangerous precedent for the political targeting of our federal judges?" The room held its breath. This was the trap, a question designed to bog Vance down in legal jargon, to make him look like a reckless amateur meddling in affairs beyond his grasp. The reporters' pens hovered over their notepads. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't look at his notes. He didn't even look at Van Hollen. He looked directly into the central C-SPAN camera, his gaze burning with an intensity that seemed to shrink the vast room. With all due respect, Senator Vance's voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the chamber a rumble of controlled thunder. "You're fundamentally mistaken about who this hearing is for. It isn't for you. It isn't for the members of this committee. It isn't even for me." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "This hearing is for the steelworker in Lorain, Ohio, whose pension fund was gutted by a corporation that walked away scot-free because of a last-minute inexplicable ruling from a federal judge. It's for the families in East Palestine who are still breathing toxic air and wondering if anyone in this city even remembers their names. You want to talk about dangerous precedents. Senator, the most dangerous precedent of all, is a system where the powerful can write their own rules behind closed doors, a system where justice is a commodity to be bought and sold, while good people are told to just trust the process. He leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. So no, I'm not here to discuss oversight protocols with you. I'm here to demand answers for them. I'm here to pull back the curtain you and your friends have been hiding behind for far too long. This isn't a spectacle. It's a reckoning. A shockwave of silence rolled through the room. It was not the answer anyone had expected. He had refused to step into the trap. Instead, he had flipped the entire board over. The reporters weren't scribbling legal notes, they were capturing the quote that would lead every newscast. Across the dais, Chairwoman Mason's mask of neutrality slipped for a fraction of a second, revealing a flicker of stunned surprise. And Mark Van Hollen, for the first time that morning, felt a cold sliver of doubt pierce his armor of arrogance. He had expected a politician. He was facing a crusader. The performance was over. The fight had just begun. A heavy electric silence descended upon the chamber, the kind that follows a lightning strike before the thunder rolls. JD Vance's words hung in the air, a raw indictment of the very room he sat in. For a moment, the polished gears of Washington politics ground to a halt. Mark Van Hollen's face was a carefully constructed mask of composure, but behind his eyes a storm of fury and calculation was raging. He had lost the opening exchange badly. The populist from Ohio had not only sidestepped the trap, but had turned it back on him, reframing the entire hearing from a procedural inquiry into a moral crusade. Van Hollen took a slow, deliberate sip of water, buying himself a few precious seconds to recalibrate. The path of philosophy was a minefield. He had to drag this back to the cold, hard ground of facts, his version of the facts. He set the glass down with a soft, precise click. A powerful sentiment, Senator Van Hollen's voice dripped with saccharine condescension, an attempt to regain control. But this committee does not operate on sentiment. It operates on evidence. So let us speak of the evidence, or rather the event that started this firestorm. He gestured dismissively. I'm referring, of course, to the photograph. The single grainy off-center photo that appeared on the internet without context or warning, like a piece of digital arson. 6:14 a.m. Eastern Time. He projected an image onto the large screen behind the dais. The room's focus shifted to the haunting picture, Judge Linda Dugan, a federal appointee wrapped in a beige trench coat, her hands cuffed behind her back. Her head was slightly bowed as two plainclothed federal agents escorted her down the stone steps of the Third Circuit Courthouse. The pre-dawn light was grey and unforgiving, casting long shadows that seemed to cling to her. No press release, no formal announcement. Just this, Van Hollen said, his tone that of a disappointed teacher. An image posted by an anonymous social media account with a mere 183 followers. Within an hour, it was igniting 1,000 conspiracy theories. By 7:00 a.m., cable news was running frantic chyrons. Federal judge detained. What is going on? This, Senator Vance, is not how justice is conducted. This is chaos, a trial by social media. Was this your intention to bypass due process and ignite a public lynching? Vance watched the image on the screen, his expression unreadable. He saw what Van Hollen wanted everyone to see: chaos, a breach of protocol. But Vance saw something else. He saw the stark, silent truth of it. Behind him, he heard the faintest whisper of paper as Pam Bondi slid a single sheet from a binder, placing it face down on the table. It was a signal. He had the facts. Chaos. Senator Vance's voice was quiet now, drawing the room in. You see chaos. I see a moment of excruciating clarity. For months, for years, the truth about Judge Dugan's court was a secret, whispered in hallways, buried in sealed documents, and protected by a fraternity of silence. The system you praise, the due process you champion, was the very thing being used to shield her. That photo wasn't the start of the chaos. It was the end of the silence. He gestured to the screen. Look at her face. She isn't shouting. She isn't resisting. She's silent. But her silence in that moment was louder than every gavel you've ever banged. It was the sound of accountability finally arriving uninvited and inconvenient on the courthouse steps. That photo wasn't an act of arson, Senator. It was a flare shot up in the dead of night by someone who knew the whole ship was sinking. Vance leaned back, his eyes narrowing as he fixed his gaze on Van Hollen. And since we're talking about what happened that morning, let's talk about your own performance. At 7:18 a.m., you were on national television. Vance's voice took on a theatrical edge, perfectly mimicking Van Hollen's practiced outrage. This is not justice, you said, eyes locked on the camera. This is an attack on the independence of our judiciary, and I will get answers today. Vance let the imitation hang in the air, a perfect echo of Van Hollen's hypocrisy. An impressive performance, truly. You played the role of the outraged defender of the faith beautifully, but it was just that, a role. Because you weren't interested in answers. You were interested in controlling the narrative. You seized on that photo, not because you cared about due process, but because you saw an opportunity to discredit the investigation before it led to names you didn't want spoken to, doors you didn't want opened. He leaned forward again, the final question delivered like a surgeon's scalpel. The woman who spent 11 months painstakingly compiling the evidence that led to that arrest, Ms. Bondi, she was silent. The facts were moving on their own. But you, Senator, you couldn't wait to get in front of a camera. So I'll ask you the question you should have been asking all along. What were you so afraid of? A flicker of raw, unguarded fury crossed Mark Van Hollen's face before being instantly suppressed, buried beneath layers of political discipline. Vance's accusation that he was afraid was too close to the bone. The hearing room, once his arena, was rapidly becoming a cage of his own making. The air crackled with a tension that was no longer theatrical. It was real. He had tried to frame Vance as a chaotic bomb thrower. Now he needed to pivot to paint the investigation itself as a tainted, illegitimate witch hunt. He turned his attention to the silent figure seated behind Vance. Fear, Senator, is a tool of demagogues. Van Hollen retorted, his voice regaining its icy composure. I am concerned with something far more fundamental, the rule of law. And since you seem so keen to defend her methods, let us bring the architect of this chaos out from the shadows. His gaze was a spear aimed at Pam Bondi. Ms. Bondi, you were appointed as a special counsel. Your mandate, as I recall, was to review financial compliance across court-affiliated non-profits. A dry, tedious but necessary task. He paused, letting the implication of her overreach settle. Yet somehow this administrative audit morphed into a full-blown criminal crusade against a sitting federal judge. You initiated this without alerting this committee, without consulting judicial ethics boards. It seems you took it upon yourself to be judge-jury, and with the help of Senator Vance, public executioner. So let's be clear. Why the overreach, Ms. Bondi? What gave you the authority to light this match? All eyes swiveled to Pam Bondi. She remained seated, a portrait of unnerving stillness. She did not rise. She did not seem to flinch under the weight of the accusation. She simply reached forward and placed one of her binders on the table in front of Vance. She opened it to a pre-marked page. JD Vance didn't look at the page. He knew what it represented. It was time to shift from fire to ice. Senator Van Hollen accuses Ms. Bondi of overreach. Vance said, his voice now calm, taking on a new, more dangerous tone, the tone of a prosecutor laying out his case. He uses words like crusade and witch hunt to paint a picture of a rogue agent driven by ambition. He wants you to believe this started with a vendetta. It didn't. Vance slid the open binder forward so the cameras could glimpse the dense columns of numbers and legal text. It started with a number. A single, unremarkable financial transfer. An audit, as the senator correctly noted, is a tedious thing. You follow the money, you check the boxes, you sign the forms. But Ms. Bondi and her team did something that it seems very few people in this town are willing to do anymore. They didn't just check the boxes. They asked what the boxes meant. He tapped the page with his finger, though his eyes remained locked on Van Hollen. They followed the money, and the money led them down a very dark road. It led them from a non-profit to a consulting firm, from a consulting firm to a judge's family member, and from a judge's family member to a series of highly questionable court rulings. Ms. Bondi didn't light a match, Senator. She simply followed a trail of breadcrumbs, and it led her directly to a house that was already on fire. Vance paused, letting Bondi's methodical work fill the space his own fiery rhetoric had cleared. Let's talk specifics, shall we? Because this isn't about sentiment anymore, it's about receipts. He gestured for the screen to be activated. The image of Judge Dugan vanished, replaced by a flowchart, a spiderweb of corporate entities and financial transactions. Exhibitor Vance announced, his voice sharp and clear. 2 non-profit organizations, the Community Justice Initiative and the Harbor Equity Alliance. Over the fiscal years 2021 and 2022, these 2 groups received a combined total of $200,000 in federal grant money from the taxpayers of this country. He pointed to a box on the chart. Now here is Judge Linda Dugan. During that same period, she issued 6 separate rulings that directly or indirectly benefited these 2 organizations. In one instance, Harbor Equity Alliance received a favorable ruling that shielded them from a major lawsuit. 7 days later, 7 days, they secured a $3,400,000 federal grant that had been pending approval. Is that overreach, Senator, or is that a pattern? The senators on the dais began to murmur, their gazes shifting from Vance to the damning chart on the screen. The abstract political fight was now being anchored by concrete, irrefutable numbers. But it gets better. Vance continued, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He pressed a button, and 2 names on the chart lit up in bright red. This man, Kenneth Dugan, is the treasurer of the Community Justice Initiative. He is also Judge Dugan's brother-in-law, a relationship she conveniently failed to disclose in any of her judicial transparency statements. And this woman, Ms. Deirdre Lang, is a board member of Harbor Equity Alliance. She is also Judge Dugan's former law partner, another undisclosed relationship. Vance stood up, his towering presence commanding the room. He walked towards the screen, his shadow falling over the web of corruption he was exposing. This wasn't a witch hunt, Senator Van Hollen. It was an audit. A painfully thorough, brutally honest audit of a system you and your colleagues have allowed to fester in the dark. Ms. Bondi didn't overstep her mandate. She fulfilled it. She followed the money. And the money told a story. A story of conflicts of interest, of backroom deals, and of justice being sold to the highest bidder. The only person who seems to have a problem with that story is you. And I think before this day is over, we're all going to find out why. The air in the hearing room had grown thin, charged with the stark reality of the flowchart still glowing on the screen. The names, the numbers, the web of undisclosed relationships. It was no longer a matter of interpretation. It was a map that led directly to the doorstep of judicial corruption. Reporters in the press gallery were typing furiously, their faces illuminated by the pale blue light of their laptops. The murmurs among the senators had subsided, replaced by a grim, focused attention. Mark Van Hollen felt the floor shifting beneath his feet. The narrative of a rogue prosecutor was crumbling under the weight of documented evidence. He had to discredit not just the investigation's conclusion, but its very foundation. He leaned forward, his knuckles white against the dark wood of the dais, forcing a dismissive scoff. A compelling story, Senator Vance. A narrative woven with innuendo and unfortunate coincidences, he said, his voice straining to sound reasonable. Shared surnames and old business associations do not constitute a conspiracy. At worst, this is a case of poor judgment, a failure to disclose something to be handled by an ethics committee, not a prime-time political spectacle. You have shown us correlation, not causation. You have not shown us the crime. JD Vance stood motionless for a moment, letting Van Hollen's words echo in the chamber. He let the condescension, the dismissal, the attempt to minimize the rot hang in the air for everyone to hear. He then turned his head slightly toward Pam Bondi. She met his gaze and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was time to show them the crime. The senator is right, Vance said, turning back to the committee. His agreement was so unexpected it startled the room. Correlation is not a crime. A family connection is not a crime. But those things aren't the disease, Senator. They are the symptoms. The disease is far more insidious. It's the quiet, deliberate manipulation of the very records we are all sworn to trust. He gestured to the technician. Please bring up Exhibit B. The flowchart vanished. In its place, two documents appeared side by side on the screen, looking nearly identical at first glance. They were copies of a ruling from Judge Dugan's court time-stamped and bearing her official signature. What you are looking at, Vance's voice dropped, becoming a precise surgical instrument, are two versions of the same judgment. On the left is the public record, the version filed to the digital docket on March 6th at 10:47 a.m. This is the version the defense team and the public saw. He walked closer to the screen, a laser pointer appearing in his hand. A thin red beam danced across the document on the right. And this, he said, his voice resonating with cold anger, is the ghost in the machine. This is the internal version pulled from archived metadata and document recovery logs by Ms. Bondi's forensic team. It was created 5 hours after the verdict was publicly entered. It was re-uploaded by someone logged in under the credentials of Judge Dugan's own assistant. He began to circle phrases on the second document. The differences were subtle, but surgically precise. A clause removed here. A penalty recalibrated there. Language that once mandated compliance now merely encouraged review. A senator from the other side of the dais, Senator Davis, stirred in his seat, his brow furrowed. Are you implying the judge tampered with her own rulings after the fact? Vance didn't answer directly. He let the evidence speak for him. In 3 separate cases involving federal grants and non-profit beneficiaries, Ms. Bondi's team found these altered versions. Minor edits, yes, but strategically significant. And every single time, without exception, the revised language benefited the same category of litigants' entities linked to the very boards where Judge Dugan's relatives and former partners sat. A hushed gasp travelled across the chamber. This was no longer about undisclosed relationships. This was about the falsification of legal records. Van Hollen, looking visibly shaken, tried to interrupt. This is a highly technical interpretation of metadata. It could be a clerical error, a simple correction. A clerical error. Senator Vance cut him off, his voice like a whip crack. That's an interesting theory. Let's test it. He gave a signal. A new image filled the screen, a transcript of an internal chat log recovered from the court server. The names were Judge Dugan and her court administrator. The text was highlighted in stark yellow. I'll read it for the record, Vance said, his voice ringing with damning clarity. From Judge Dugan herself, clean up the language on the Greenbrook ruling so we don't raise any flags. We need to make it look like precedent. Direct quote, Senator. Clean up the language. Don't raise any flags. Does that sound like a clerical error to you? Or does that sound like a criminal instruction to tamper with evidence? The room fell into a profound, suffocating silence. Even the reporters had stopped typing. The sound of the words "make it look like precedent" landed like a physical blow. This wasn't correlation anymore. This was a confession captured in digital amber. Vance lowered the laser pointer, his hand steady. You asked me to show you the crime, Senator Van Hollen, he said, his voice low and final. There it is, right there, in black and white. The quiet, deliberate and documented act of rewriting justice when they thought no one was watching. Of course. Here is part 5, maintaining the established narrative consistency and escalating the stakes by introducing the central corrupting entity Stonebridge and connecting all the threads. Part 5. The name in the center of the web. The image of Judge Dugan's chat log remained on the screen, a silent, damning indictment that had sucked the air out of the room. The phrase "make it look like precedent" echoed in the minds of everyone present. It was a mortal wound to Van Hollen's defense, a clear, unambiguous piece of evidence that shifted the hearing from a political skirmish to a criminal inquest. The carefully constructed walls of his narrative clerical errors, unfortunate coincidences, political overreach were collapsing into dust. Mark Van Hollen sat rigidly in his chair, his face a pale mask. He looked trapped, his eyes darting from the screen to Chairwoman Mason as if searching for an escape route that no longer existed. He had built this arena to destroy Vance, but now he was the one facing the lions. JD Vance let the silence do its work. He watched the senators exchange wary, shocked glances. He saw the understanding dawn on their faces. This was not an isolated case of one corrupt judge. The instruction to clean up the language implied a system, a process. It was a cancer, and they had only just seen the first tumor. It was time to show them how far the disease had spread. "What you have just seen," Vance said, his voice cutting through the heavy silence, "is the how. How justice was manipulated at the source. How the public record became a work of fiction. But that single act of tampering, as shocking as it is not the most terrifying part of this story. The most terrifying part is the why and the who." He signaled to the technician. The chat log vanished, replaced by a new, more complex diagram. It was a flowchart, but unlike the first one, this was denser, more intricate. At first glance, it was a confusing web of case names, corporate entities, and arrows. 4 seemingly unrelated cases were listed at the top: a dispute over environmental compliance, a conflict involving tax-exempt status, a housing subsidy reversal, and a procurement lawsuit against a federal subcontractor. All presided over by Judge Dugan, all appearing to have nothing in common. But as Vance began to speak, the true nature of the diagram became chillingly clear. In the very center of that sprawling web, one name stood out, connected by red lines to every single case, every non-profit, every key player: Stonebridge Strategic Consulting. Vance announced, his voice low and deliberate, each syllable landing with the weight of a hammer blow. To the public, it's a high-powered lobbying firm. But Ms. Bondi's investigation uncovered its true business. It's a ghost, a shadow partner that operates in the spaces between law, politics, and finance. It managed the administrative services for the very non-profits we discussed earlier, Harbor Equity Alliance and the Community Justice Initiative. But more importantly, it provided behind-the-scenes litigation support in these cases. Senator Blake, a respected moderate, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Litigation support? Are you suggesting her rulings were ghost-written by an outside firm?" "I'm suggesting," Vance replied, "that we have found linguistic matches between Stonebridge's internal strategy briefs and the final decisions issued by Judge Dugan. I'm suggesting we have time-coded file access logs and unencrypted email drafts that make it highly unlikely she wrote those opinions in a vacuum. It wasn't an accidental overlap, it was mirroring." He pressed a button. The diagram zoomed in, highlighting the name Stonebridge and its connection to Kenneth Dugan, the judge's brother-in-law. And who, you might ask, is the chief financial officer of this shadow firm? None other than Mr. Kenneth Dugan, the same man whose role as treasurer of a non-profit receiving federal funds was never disclosed. It turns out he was also running the very firm that was shaping the legal arguments that would benefit that non-profit. The room erupted in a wave of hushed, frantic whispers. This was the nexus, the single unifying element that tied everything together. The family connection wasn't just a conflict of interest. It was the key to the entire criminal enterprise. Stonebridge was the engine, the non-profits were the fuel, and Judge Dugan's bench was the weapon. Van Hollen, desperate to regain any semblance of control, finally broke his silence. His voice was strained, brittle. "You're connecting dots that aren't there. This is pure narrative building based on shared surnames and tenuous overlaps. This is not proof." Vance turned his full attention to him, his eyes blazing with righteous fire. "Coincidence doesn't repeat 4 times, Senator A. Coincidence is forgetting your keys. This is a business model. This is architecture." He pointed back to the screen, his voice rising, filling the chamber. "Look at it. It's all there. Stonebridge wasn't just a consultant. It was a compliance subcontractor for the non-profits. Their fees were deducted directly from the taxpayer grant money. On paper, they were offering advice. In practice, they were laundering influence. They shaped the language of the rulings. Their executive team included the judge's family, and they got paid with federal funds that were released because of those very rulings." He took a step closer to the dais, his gaze burning into Van Hollen. "You talk about proof, Senator. This isn't just a smoking gun. This is the factory where the guns were made, the receipts for the bullets, and the fingerprints of the people who pulled the trigger. Judge Dugan isn't an isolated figure. She's a node in a network, and Stonebridge Strategic Consulting is the name in the center of the web. The image of the Stonebridge network, a sprawling map of institutional rot, held the room in a state of horrified hypnosis. The name, once a generic corporate moniker, now felt sinister, its tendrils reaching into every corner of the case. The senators on the dais were no longer passive observers. They were staring into an abyss that threatened to swallow the very foundations of the institution they served. The air was thick with the chilling realization that this was not about one bad apple. This was about the orchard itself. Senator Davis, the same man who had first questioned the tampered rulings, now spoke with a new gravity, his voice heavy with the weight of what he was witnessing. "If what you're saying is true, Senator Vance," he said, addressing not just Vance, but the entire room, "then we are no longer looking at a conflict of interest. We are looking at institutional compromise on a scale that is staggering." JD Vance gave a slow, somber nod. That senator is the crux of the matter. Judge Dugan was never the endpoint of this investigation. She was the entry point. She was the loose thread that, when pulled, threatened to unravel the entire tapestry. He turned back to the screen. For a moment, he felt the immense pressure of the task, the weight of the truths he was about to unleash. He thought of Pam Bondi's years of thankless, meticulous work, the risks taken by whistleblowers who had lost their careers, the quiet suffering of families in Ohio who had no idea their lives had been altered by a decision made in a back room 1,000 miles away. This was for them. This was the moment their silence found its voice. For weeks, Vance continued his voice resonating with a solemn power. Senator Van Hollen and his allies have framed this as an attack on one judge. They have tried to contain the damage, to build a firewall around Judge Dugan and sacrifice her to save the system. They want you to believe she is a rogue actor, an anomaly. She is not. He signaled to the technician. The Stonebridge diagram dissolved, replaced by a stark, simple list. 5 names, 5 portraits, 5 sitting federal judges from 4 different states. A wave of audible gasps swept through the chamber. This was a breathtaking escalation. Naming one judge was a scandal. Naming 5 was a declaration of war on the federal judiciary. Based on the data uncovered by Ms. Bondi's team during the Dugan investigation, Vance stated each word chosen with surgical precision. "We have reason to believe that these 5 federal judges have rendered rulings with material benefit to the same constellation of non-profit and consulting entities, all linked back to Stonebridge Strategic. Their cases are now under internal review by the Office of the Inspector General." Mark Van Hollen shot to his feet, his composure finally spectacularly shattering. The mask of the calm institutionalist fell away, revealing the face of a cornered, furious man. "This is outrageous," he roared, slamming his palm on the table. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the tense room. "This is a reckless, despicable smear campaign. You are throwing names into the fire without formal charges, without due process. You are assassinating careers on live television. Do you understand what you are doing, Vance? You are burning down public trust in our judiciary." Vance stood his ground unmoving, letting Van Hollen's fury wash over him. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. When the outburst subsided, he responded with a calm that was more cutting than any shout. "Public trust, Senator," he asked, his voice quiet but sharp. "If public trust is so fragile that it shatters under the weight of the truth, then it was never trust to begin with. It was an illusion. And it's an illusion that has cost the American people dearly." He turned to face Van Hollen fully. "You talk about due process. What about the due process for the thousands of plaintiffs whose cases were decided by judges with undisclosed conflicts of interest? You talk about career assassination. What about the careers of the whistleblowers who were reassigned and silenced for trying to report this no senator? This isn't a smear campaign. This is accountability. It's messy, it's painful, and it's years overdue." He gestured back to the list of names on the screen. These 5 judges share more than just a connection to Stonebridge. They share a pattern of questionable financial disclosures. In 2 cases, they have immediate family members employed by Stonebridge-affiliated groups, a fact none of them disclosed. They are part of an unspoken fraternity, a network of influence that operates on favors, shared interests, and the quiet confidence that no one would ever dare to look too closely. Vance's gaze swept across the faces of the other senators. The system didn't fail to catch this, Senator Van Hollen. The system was designed not to catch this. It was designed to protect its own. Until now. The chamber was gripped by a stunned, suffocating silence. The 5 names on the screen were no longer just names. They were symbols of a deep systemic rot that extended far beyond a single courtroom. The narrative had irrevocably shifted. This was no longer about JD Vance's populism versus Mark Van Hollen's institutionalism. It was about a hidden network of power being dragged kicking and screaming into the light. Van Hollen sank back into his chair, his face ashen. His furious outburst had done nothing but expose his own desperation. He was losing, and he knew it. He had tried to paint Vance as a reckless arsonist, but the evidence presented was too methodical, too damning. Now Vance stood before the committee not as a politician, but as the bearer of an ugly, undeniable truth. The other senators, once his allies or at least neutral observers, now looked at him with a mixture of fear and suspicion. The unspoken question hung in the air. What did you know JD Vance knew this was the moment to connect the final dots to bridge the gap between the compromised judiciary and the halls of Congress itself? He had shown them the corruption on the bench. Now he would show them who had helped lock the doors to the courthouse from the outside. He looked toward Pam Bondi, who gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was time for the next phase. Senator Van Hollen speaks of trust in our institutions. Vance began, his voice taking on a somber, almost mournful tone. But what happens when the very mechanisms designed to ensure that trust, the oversight committees, the ethics boards, the whistleblower channels, are themselves compromised? What happens when the watchdogs are in league with the wolves? He signaled to the technician. The list of judges was replaced by something that looked at first glance mundane, a simple calendar showing dates from the past 20 months. But next to certain dates were names and meeting slots pulled directly from the Capitol Visitors System access logs. These are not secret documents, Vance explained. They are public records hidden in plain sight. They show repeated visits by registered lobbyists and representatives from Harbor Equity Alliance and Stonebridge Strategic Consulting. Visits to several congressional offices, including... He paused, letting the weight of his next words land. Offices of members of this very committee. A current of unease rippled through the dais. Senators who had been leaning forward now sat back, a new personal defensiveness in their posture. The investigation was no longer about them, it was about us. Staffers talk to lobbyists all the time, Van Hollen interjected, his voice raspy. That is not a crime, that is how this city functions. I agree, Senator, Vance said calmly. Access is not a crime, but it becomes the currency of corruption, and sometimes that access leads to a very lucrative revolving door. The screen changed again. A professional profile appeared, a smiling headshot, a list of career highlights. The name read, Tyler Morris, General Counsel, Harbor Equity Alliance. And beneath it, in bold letters, was his previous position, former Senior Policy Advisor, Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Grants and Oversight. The chamber shifted. The abstract threat had become concrete, embodied by the smiling face on the screen. Mr. Morris left his position on this committee just 8 months ago, Vance stated, his voice cold and flat. But our investigation, thanks to Ms. Bondi's meticulous work, found something fascinating. During his time here, Mr. Morris participated in 3 drafting sessions for legislation that amended federal oversight protocols for grant recipients. He helped structure language that coincidentally narrowed the reporting requirements for subcontractor payments, language that passed just 6 weeks before Stonebridge was hired as a subcontractor in 2 of Judge Dugan's most controversial cases. The implications were staggering. A congressional staffer had helped write the rules, then left to join the very company that would benefit from the loopholes he had helped create. This is not about a former intern's career path, as you might suggest, Senator Vance said, his gaze fixed on Van Hollen. This is about the timeline. A timeline where legislation is shaped, funds are released, favorable rulings are issued, and the person who helped craft the legislation ends up working for the beneficiary. It's a perfectly legal, perfectly corrupt circle of influence. Van Hollen was speechless. His face was a mask of disbelief and dawning horror. This was an attack on his own turf, on his own people. Vance wasn't finished. He took a step closer, his voice dropping to an intense, almost conspiratorial whisper that every microphone in the room strained to catch. But the real question, Senator, is not about Tyler Morris. The question is about the office he worked for, the office that gave him the access and the influence to shape that legislation. He let the silence stretch, forcing every person in the room to connect the dots themselves. The name of the subcommittee he had mentioned hung in the air like a guillotine. "You see," Vance continued, "we have the internal communications. Emails between Stonebridge and congressional offices discussing policy talking points and draft language. Language that, through some miracle of coincidence, appeared nearly word for word in a ruling Judge Dugan issued 3 weeks later." He turned to Pam Bondi. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick sealed manila envelope. She held it up for the cameras to see. It was a physical object, a tangible piece of the conspiracy. "Ms. Bondi is prepared to submit this envelope to the committee record," Vance announced. "But I want everyone in this room to understand what it contains. It contains proof that the rot wasn't just on the bench. It was right here in these halls. It implicates staffers who took their orders from the very top." He turned and looked directly at Van Hollen, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. "It implicates a senior policy advisor who worked until his resignation this morning directly for you, Senator. The question is no longer what Judge Dugan did. The question is, what did your office know, and when did you know it?" The sealed manila envelope in Pam Bondi's hand was no longer just a piece of evidence. It was a bomb. JD Vance's final accusation, a direct surgical strike at the heart of Mark Van Hollen's own office, had detonated in the chamber, and the shrapnel of its implication hit everyone. The room, which had already been tense, now felt like a vacuum. Sound, air, and time itself seemed to have been sucked out of it. The cameras zoomed in, capturing every microscopic detail: the tremor in Van Hollen's hand, the beads of sweat on his brow, the stunned, wide-eyed horror on the faces of his remaining aides. Van Hollen opened his mouth, but no words came out. He was a man drowning in plain sight, his authority, his reputation, his entire political world collapsing around him in slow motion. The populist he had so arrogantly dismissed had not just outmaneuvered him. He had cornered him with a truth so specific, so personal, that there was no room left to lie. Chairwoman Judy Mason. Her face grim, finally broke the spell. Her voice was strained but firm. "Ms. Bondi, submit the envelope to the clerk for the official record." Bondi stepped forward with a quiet, solemn grace and placed the envelope on the clerk's desk. The soft thud of the paper hitting the wood was the only sound in the cavernous room, and it echoed like the fall of a king. Vance watched the transfer, his expression a mixture of grim satisfaction and profound sorrow. He had no joy in this. This was not a victory to be celebrated. It was a cancer being excised, a painful but necessary surgery on the body politic. He knew that the documents in that envelope filled with emails and memos were devastating. But he also knew that to truly make the country understand the depth of this betrayal, they needed to hear not just the evidence of the crime, but the testimony of its cost. "Documents can be dismissed," Vance said, turning back to the committee, his voice softening, becoming more intimate. "Statistics can be debated, but the human cost of this corruption, that is something we cannot ignore. For every rule that was bent, for every truth that was buried, there was a person who saw it happen. A person who was told to look the other way, to stay in their lane, to be a team player. A person who was punished not for lying, but for refusing to." He gestured to the screen. The complex diagrams and documents were gone. In their place, 2 simple audio waveforms appeared labeled only Witness A and Witness B. "These are the voices of 2 former judicial aides from Judge Dugan's chambers," Vance explained. "Their identities are protected under whistleblower provisions for their own safety. They are not here today because they are afraid. Not of the truth, but of the system that tried to silence them. A system that Senator Van Hollen claims to be defending." Van Hollen, desperate for any lifeline, scoffed weakly. Anonymous testimony. Convenient. Hearsay from disgruntled former employees. Let the American people decide if this is hearsay. Vance shot back, his eyes flashing. He nodded to the technician. Play witness A. The speakers crackled to life. A man's voice, steady but filled with a deep-seated weariness, filled the room. I was instructed to delay filing the official judgment transcript by 48 hours. The reason given was administrative backlog, but I later saw an earlier version of the same ruling with different phrasing. The final one, it was more favorable to the non-profit party. I knew it was wrong. I tried to flag it. My supervisor told me I was misunderstanding the judge's intent. The audio cut out. Before the room could fully process it, Vance said, "Play witness B." A woman's voice, tight with years of suppressed anxiety, came through. Judge Dugan often took meetings off the official schedule. Notes I was asked to destroy. They weren't part of any case file. When I questioned it, I was told it was above my pay grade. Within a week, I was reassigned to the records basement. They called it a personnel redistribution. I called it a punishment for asking the wrong question. The recording stopped. A profound, heartbreaking silence settled over the chamber. This was the human face of the clerical errors and unfortunate coincidences. This was the lived reality of the corruption. It wasn't just about money and power. It was about the crushing of decent people, the slow grinding down of their principles until they either broke or were cast aside. Vance let the weight of their words settle. These individuals didn't come forward for revenge, he said softly. They came forward because they believed in the law. They believed in the oath they took. They believed the system would protect them. And the system, Senator Van Hollen, the system you champion, utterly failed them. It didn't just ignore them. It punished them. He held up a thin folder separate from the others. It was a physical token of their courage. One of these aides, after being reassigned, fell into a deep depression. He told Ms. Bondi's investigators he contemplated ending his life. Not because he had done something wrong, but because he couldn't make anyone care that something wrong was happening. That is the price of your order, Senator. That is the cost of your stability. He looked directly at Van Hollen. His voice, now devoid of anger, filled only with a deep, sorrowful judgment. You demanded facts. We gave you facts. You demanded documents. We produced them. And now you want to dismiss the voices of the people who were crushed by this machine because it's inconvenient. This isn't just about a broken system anymore. It's about the broken lives it leaves in its wake. The raw human testimony of the whistleblowers had stripped away the last vestiges of political abstraction. The hearing was no longer about legal theory or procedural debate. It was about the moral fabric of the nation. The senators sat in stunned silence, the weight of the aide's stories pressing down on them. The image of a young clerk driven to despair not by guilt, but by the system's calculated indifference was a more powerful indictment than any financial statement. Mark Van Hollen was a ghost at the table. His authority eviscerated, his arguments rendered hollow. JD Vance knew the foundation of the old order was shattered. It was time to bring the temple itself crashing down. He had exposed the soldiers and the architects of the conspiracy. Now he would name their king, the very man entrusted to be the guardian of the system's integrity. He took a slow breath, centering himself. This next step was the most dangerous. It would provoke the most ferocious backlash. It was an attack on a sacred cow, a figure universally lauded as a paragon of judicial ethics. He glanced at Pam Bondi. Her expression was like stone, impassive, resolute. She had given him the weapon. It was his duty to wield it. For the past several hours, Vance began, his voice regaining its solemn prosecutorial tone. We have been tracing the threads of a complex web. We've seen how money, influence, and family ties created a system of protected corruption. But a network this sophisticated, this resilient, cannot survive on its own. It needs more than just participants. It needs a protector. It needs a shepherd. He paused, letting the metaphor sink in. It needs someone at the very top, a figure of unimpeachable authority who can curate the silence. Someone who can ensure that complaints are buried, that investigations are halted, and that the illusion of integrity is maintained at all costs. A new sense of dread filled the room. The senators shifted uneasily. They sensed where this was going. "I want the record to reflect," Vance said, his voice ringing with a formal gravity, "that what I am about to disclose does not rest on speculation. It rests on documents, on sworn testimony, and on a chain of authorization that until today remained hidden behind a wall of manufactured respectability." He signaled to the technician. A new slide appeared on the screen. It was not a chart or a document, but a single official portrait. A distinguished silver-haired man with kind eyes and an expression of thoughtful wisdom. His name was printed in bold beneath it: Judge Thomas J. Renier. A collective audible intake of breath swept through the chamber. It was a sound of pure shock. Judge Renier was not just a judge, he was an institution, a senior figure on the Federal Judicial Budget Oversight Board, a man whose name was synonymous with courtroom integrity, a frequent guest on C-SPAN, a keynote speaker at law school ethics panels. He was the watchdog. "Judge Renier," Vance said softly, the quiet words more devastating than a shout. "But he fed the wolves." Senator Holly, a conservative lawmaker who had remained mostly silent, leaned forward, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Judge Renier is currently overseeing the discretionary allocations for judicial training and ethics enforcement. Are you suggesting—" "I am not suggesting," Vance interrupted, his voice hardening. "I am stating. For the past 9 years, Judge Renier has used his position on that board to push grant funding to the very oversight bodies that repeatedly failed to audit Judge Dugan's chambers." He publicly and sustainedly defended Judge Dugan, publishing 2 statements praising her judicial temperament. He nominated her for a special appointment in 2021. And most damningly, Vance's voice dropped to a low, chilling register. He served as the external ethics advisor on one of the 12 formal complaints filed against her, a complaint that was, of course, dismissed without a hearing. The room was in chaos. Van Hollen, seeing a fleeting, desperate chance to reframe the narrative, shot to his feet, his voice hoarse with manufactured rage. "You are destroying a man's life on live television, a judge who has spent 3 decades protecting the rule of law, and you reduce him to a conspirator based on innuendo. This is a political assassination." Vance turned to face him, his expression one of pity, not anger. "No, Senator. I am not destroying his life. I am exposing his influence, and the evidence speaks for itself." The screen changed again, displaying a copy of an internal memo from the Judicial Advancement Committee marked "Confidential." It showed Judge Renier's personal signature approving a $12,300 grant. This grant, Vance explained, was to create a series of ethics workshops. Workshops that by design excluded the topic of financial disclosure conflicts. One of those workshops, Senator, was hosted at the very courthouse where Judge Dugan presided. He let the fact sink in. The man in charge of ethics was funding ethics training that deliberately ignored the very type of corruption he was helping to conceal. "This is not innuendo," Vance declared, his voice rising to fill the chamber. "This is systemic enablement, when the very people we trust to investigate corruption are the ones orchestrating the silence we no longer have oversight. We have insulation. We have a self-protecting fraternity, and Judge Thomas Renier was its gatekeeper. He wasn't just another node in the network. He was the man who held the keys to the kingdom, ensuring that the walls of the castle were never breached. He wasn't just a part of the system. He was the system." The accusation against Judge Thomas J. Renier, the system's supposed guardian, hung in the air like radioactive fallout. The name itself had shattered the committee's remaining composure. This was no longer about a corrupt judge or a shadowy consulting firm. This was about the betrayal of an entire institution by one of its most revered figures. The hearing had reached a point of no return. The very legitimacy of the federal judiciary was now on trial. Senator Holly, his face a mask of grim determination, immediately addressed the chair. "Madam Chair," he said, his voice firm, "I recommend we schedule an immediate closed-door review session on Judge Renier's role in all prior complaint dismissals. This cannot be brushed aside." Chairwoman Mason, looking exhausted but resolute, nodded slowly. "Agreed. The committee will convene privately to discuss next steps." Her eyes, however, remained fixed on JD Vance. The question was unspoken but clear. Is there more? Vance knew this was the critical juncture. He had exposed the key players from the foot soldiers to the king. Now he had to expose the machinery of their kingdom, the sophisticated quasi-legal mechanism they had built to hide their crimes in plain sight. This was the part of the story that would resonate most deeply, for it revealed not just a failure of individuals, but a perversion of the very tools meant to protect justice. Before we discuss next steps, Vance said, his voice drawing the room back into his orbit, it is crucial that this committee understands how Judge Raniere was able to provide this insulation. It wasn't through threats or backroom bribes. It was through something far more elegant, far more insidious. It was through a fund. He signaled to the technician. The portrait of Judge Raniere was replaced by a slide with a grand official-sounding title, the Judicial Integrity Trust Fund. This fund was established 12 years ago, with a noble purpose to provide support for underfunded courts, to promote judicial education, and to finance independent civic council groups that could offer amicus briefs and advisory opinions, thereby strengthening the quality of our justice system. And it was managed in large part by Judge Raniere's administrative office. Vance walked slowly toward the screen, his presence filling the space. It was a laudable goal, but like so many noble things in this city, it was corrupted. It was turned from a shield into a sword. The projector flickered, displaying a funding matrix, a spreadsheet linking the Judicial Integrity Trust Fund to 12 different legal support organizations. Beside each organization were case numbers. Real cases, real plaintiffs, real defendants. These 12 cases, Vance explained, received indirect legal support from these advisory panels listed in court records as Independent Civic Counsel. But Ms. Bondi's forensic accountants discovered the truth. The source of their funding was not charitable donations. It was the Judicial Integrity Trust. This was never disclosed to the court, and it was never disclosed to the opposing counsel. Senator Blake leaned forward, his face a knot of confusion. Wait, you're saying these advisory groups, which are supposed to be neutral, were secretly funded by a trust overseen by Judge Raniere? Precisely, Senator Vance confirmed. They were pipelines. They were a mechanism for laundering legitimacy. What looked like neutral third-party advocacy was in fact strategically targeted influence paid for by a fund created to protect judicial objectivity. It was a brilliant self-sustaining loop of corruption. The screen changed again, displaying a clean, undeniable diagram. Arrows connected the Judicial Integrity Trust to 3 of the advisory non-profits. From those non-profits, more arrows pointed to a single familiar logo in the center: Stonebridge Strategic Consulting. The very same organizations we traced back to the Dugan rulings, Vance said, his voice laced with cold fury, were receiving strategic allocations from this trust. And in every single one of these 12 cases, the final ruling favored the party associated with the secretly funded advisory group. They didn't have to buy the rulings directly. They bought the silence. They bought the veneer of impartiality. They built a system so procedural, so technical, that even the judges involved could claim ignorance while the outcomes were guided from behind the scenes. Chairwoman Mason, looking visibly ill, spoke carefully. Do you have the names of the individuals on the fund's administrative board? We do, Vance replied, his gaze sweeping across the dais. The board included 5 members. 3 of them currently serve on federal budget subcommittees. One is a senior legal advisor for this very Judiciary Committee. And one, he paused, letting the final blow land, is now a sitting judge in the 4th Circuit. A wave of despair washed over the room. The rot was everywhere. It was in Congress, on the bench, in the very funds meant to safeguard the system. Van Hollen, who had been silent for some time, made one last feeble attempt at a defense. You imply that anyone affiliated with these boards is inherently compromised. That is a reckless and unfair leap. Vance turned his full attention to him, his eyes burning with the fire of absolute conviction. What is reckless, Senator, is allowing the public to believe justice is impartial, when in truth it is being quietly shaped by those who can afford the tools to shape it. What I am presenting today isn't an implication. It is $14,700,000 in documented transactions from a trust that betrayed its own name. It's not transparency. It's a strategy. He stepped back, his voice dropping slightly, but losing none of its power. I didn't come here today to destroy confidence in the judiciary. I came here to stop the judiciary from destroying itself. Integrity is not something we can outsource to a trust fund. It has to be earned again and again with every decision made in the light. The revelation of the Judicial Integrity Trust Fund had transformed the hearing into a post-mortem examination of a system that had died in secret. The air was heavy with consequence. The senators, once arbiters of the debate, were now silent witnesses to a truth far larger and more terrifying than they had imagined. The intricate web of deceit laundered through the very mechanisms of justice was now laid bare for the world to see. JD Vance stood at the center of the chamber, a solitary figure against the backdrop of institutional failure. He could see the despair in the room, the dawning recognition that this was not a problem that could be solved with a new rule or a special committee. This was a cultural rot, a cancer that had metastasized. He knew that for the lesson to be truly learned, he had to make it personal one last time. He had to show them that this network wasn't just made of shell corporations and trust funds. It was made of people. People they knew, people they worked with, people they trusted. He took a moment, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces, letting the weight of the previous revelation settle. Then he signaled to the technician. The diagram of the corrupt trust fund dissolved. The screen went black for a half-second, then returned with a simple chilling header, Entity Cross-Reference Key Personnel. Below it, a web of names appeared, 17 of them. Each one was marked with thin red lines, connecting them to case numbers, to advisory boards, to Stonebridge, or to the non-profits. It was the conspiracy's roll call. Many of you might think this is about one person, one judge, one corrupted trust. Vance began, his voice low, and even the calm making his words all the more menacing. It's not. A system like this is a living organism. It needs more than just a brain. It needs connective tissue. It needs people who can move between worlds, who can carry messages, who can translate influence into action. These, he gestured to the screen, are the 17 individuals who formed that tissue. The senators leaned forward, their eyes scanning the list, searching for familiar names. The reporters in the gallery were taking pictures of the screen, the clicks of their cameras like a frantic metallic heartbeat. Every name on this list has been triple verified by Ms. Bondi's team through court records, donor disclosures, and internal communications. Vance stated, his voice a steady, damning rhythm. They appeared over and over again, often quietly, sometimes in footnotes, sometimes as expert witnesses or consultants behind closed doors. Some of them have held federal security clearances. Others have written op-eds in national outlets about the sanctity of the judicial process. He paused, letting the irony land, served as a compliance officer for a judicial ethics panel while moonlighting as a strategic advisor for Stonebridge. The silence in the room was now absolute. It was the stillness of pure, unadulterated shock. And of course, Vance continued, his voice dropping as he prepared to deliver the final personal blow, the path of influence often runs through these very halls. 2 of these individuals previously served as congressional aides. He pressed a button. The map zoomed in on one name, highlighting it in blood-red: Michael Renaer. Michael Renaer, Vance announced, the name echoing in the silent chamber. From 2015 to 2018, he was a legislative assistant in this building. He now works as a senior legal policy advisor for the Stonebridge Legal Forum, an entity named in 4 of the questionable cases we have outlined today. Van Hollen's head snapped up. A flicker of recognition and pure terror flashed in his eyes. Vance's gaze locked onto his. And who is Michael Renaer? Is he just another ambitious young man who passed through the revolving door? No. He is the nephew of Judge Thomas J. Renaer. But that is not his most significant connection. Vance took a deliberate step toward the dais, his eyes never leaving Van Hollen's. His most significant connection for the purposes of this hearing is the man he served for 3 years, the man who gave him his start in this city, the man whose office he worked out of while Stonebridge was solidifying its network of influence. He let the unspoken accusation hang in the air for a final excruciating moment. I'm not suggesting that a former intern's career path invalidates years of public service, Vance said, his voice dripping with cold measured sarcasm, directly quoting Van Hollen's earlier weaker defences. "I'm suggesting that conflict of interest doesn't always come wrapped in criminal intent. Sometimes, Senator, it's embedded in the relationships we choose not to examine, the relationships we cultivate, the people we mentor." He turned back to the committee, his voice ringing out with finality. From 2015 to 2018, Michael Renair, the nephew of the corrupt judge and a future employee of the corrupt firm, was a legislative assistant to Senator Mark Van Hollen. It was over. The final connection had been made. The web was not something happening out there. It led directly to the man sitting at the head of the dais, the man who had convened this hearing to destroy him. Van Hollen looked as if he had been physically struck. The populist from Ohio hadn't just won the debate. He had exposed Van Hollen's entire world as a lie, and he had done it using Van Hollen's own people. The hunter had become the prey, and the arena was now his cage. The name Michael Renair and his connection to Senator Mark Van Hollen echoed in the cavernous chamber, not as a shout, but as a final, deafening whisper. The web was complete. Every line, every node, every whispered conspiracy now led back to the man who had orchestrated this hearing as a political assassination. Mark Van Hollen sat frozen, a monument to his own hubris, his face a canvas of utter ruin. The cameras lingered on him mercilessly, documenting the precise moment a political titan was broken on the wheel of a truth he had fatally underestimated. JD Vance watched him for a long moment, not with triumph, but with a profound, weary gravity. The battle was won. The evidence had been laid bare, the network exposed, the king dethroned. But the war for the soul of the institution was far from over. This final act was not about securing a conviction in the court of public opinion. It was about forcing every person in that room and every person watching at home to look in the mirror. He stepped back from the podium, creating a space between himself and the wreckage he had wrought. The energy in the room shifted from shock to something deeper, a heavy, introspective silence. The senators were no longer just judging the evidence. They were judging themselves. For hours, Vance began his voice, now devoid of anger or accusation, imbued with the quiet authority of a man who had earned the right to speak a hard truth. "We have descended into a dark place. A place of compromised judges, ghost-written rulings, laundered influence, and corrupted trusts. We have named names, we have followed the money, and we have exposed a rot that has burrowed deep into the foundations of our republic." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the faces of the committee members, meeting each of their eyes in turn. It would be easy to end here. It would be easy to declare victory, to demand resignations, to call for indictments. And those things must happen. Justice demands it. But if that is all we take from this day, then we will have failed. He walked to the center of the room, standing not as a senator or a prosecutor, but simply as a citizen. The real tragedy here is not the existence of a man like Judge Renair or a firm like Stonebridge. The real tragedy is the system that allowed them to flourish. A system built on a culture of silence, a culture of going along to get along, a culture that confuses civility with complicity and stability with the status quo. He turned his attention back to the C-SPAN cameras, speaking not to the powerful people in the room, but to the millions of ordinary Americans watching, the steelworkers, the nurses, the farmers, the teachers. "The people I represent in Ohio, they aren't cynical," he said, his voice filled with a raw, heartfelt passion. "They are betrayed. They are told to believe in a system of laws, not of men. But what they see is a system where the laws are just tools for the powerful men who write them. They see a game that is rigged, and they are tired of being the ones who pay the price." We are told to trust our institutions," he continued, his voice rising. "But what does that mean? Does it mean we must blindly trust a judge who takes secret instructions? Does it mean we must trust an ethics board that is funded by the very people it's supposed to police? Does it mean we must trust the process when the process itself is designed to bury the truth?" He shook his head, a gesture of profound disappointment. "No, trust is not a gift. It is not an inheritance. It is earned. It is earned through transparency. It is earned through accountability. And it is earned by having the courage to tear down the parts of our institutions that have become sick so that we can rebuild them stronger. He turned for a final time to the committee, his gaze resting on Chairwoman Mason. This is no longer about Judge Dugan or Senator Van Hollen. This is about us. It is about the choice that lies before this committee and this country. Do we patch up the cracks and pretend the foundation is still sound? Do we scapegoat a few individuals and allow the culture that created them to persist? Or do we have the courage to begin the painful, necessary work of truly cleaning our own house? He picked up his briefcase. He did not look at Pam Bondi, but he knew she was standing her work complete. He had been the voice, but she had been the truth. I have presented the facts as we have found them. He concluded, his voice a quiet, powerful resolution. The evidence is now part of the permanent record of this Congress. It cannot be unsaid. It cannot be buried. The choice of what to do next is yours. He turned and walked toward the chamber doors without a backward glance. He didn't need to. He hadn't just won a hearing. He had held up a mirror to the soul of Washington, and the reflection was ugly, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. The silence he left behind was the sound of a choice being weighed, a choice between the comfortable lie and the hard, cleansing truth. The great oak doors of the hearing chamber closed behind JD Vance with a soft, final thud. He left behind a room not in chaos, but in a state of suspended animation, the air thick with the ghosts of the truths he had unleashed. The senators remained in their seats, staring blankly at the empty witness table, as if they could still see the charts, the names, the damning evidence hanging in the air. The bright hot lights of the television cameras felt like interrogators' lamps, exposing every flicker of fear and uncertainty on their faces. The hearing was over, but the reckoning had just begun. Mark Van Hollen did not move. He sat like a statue carved from ruin, his face a hollow mask. His aides fluttered around him, whispering urgent, useless advice, but he didn't seem to hear them. The intricate world he had so carefully constructed, a world of influence, control, and protected secrets, had been publicly dismantled brick by painful brick. He was no longer a power broker. He was a political leper, a living symbol of the very swamp Vance had vowed to drain. The silence from his colleagues was more damning than any accusation. It was the sound of his own political obituary being written. Outside the chamber, the storm broke. The marble hallways of the Capitol, usually a river of purposeful motion, became a churning sea of frantic activity. Reporters sprinted for the exits, shouting into their phones, their words a chaotic symphony of breaking news. Renier named, Van Hollen implicated, Stonebridge. It's bigger than we thought. The story was no longer just a political headline. It was a seismic event, a 9.0 on the Richter scale of Washington scandal. By morning, the nation awoke not to debate, but to fallout. The headlines didn't scream. They struck with the cold, hard impact of fact. The Washington Post ran a stark front-page banner, Vance hearing exposes systemic judicial corruption, senior judge congressional officers implicated. The Wall Street Journal focused on the financial artery, Stonebridge strategic at center of widening probe, judicial integrity trust, funds frozen. The digital world was a wildfire. On social media, the hashtag #ChanceMakeItLook, like precedent, trended globally. Judge Dugan's damning words transformed into a meme for systemic hypocrisy. Clips of Vance's speeches, particularly his impassioned defense of the Ohio steelworker, were viewed millions of times, shared not just by political activists, but by ordinary people who felt that for the first time someone had spoken their language. The receipt, the $78,000 invoice, became a viral symbol of transactional justice. But the most significant impact was not in the headlines or on the internet. It was in the silent, panicked reactions of the powerful. In courthouses across the East Coast, a quiet terror took hold. A federal judge in New Jersey, one of the 5 named by Vance, abruptly vacated his chambers, citing sudden health reasons. Another in Georgia submitted a terse one-sentence resignation letter to the chief judge's office, effective immediately. No explanation was given. None was needed. The unspoken fraternity, once a source of strength and protection, had become a circle of contagion. Stonebridge Strategic Consulting, the shadowy firm at the center of the web, was a ghost ship. Its Washington, D.C. office was dark, its phone lines disconnected. The board of the Community Justice Initiative issued a single terse statement. All operations are suspended pending an external review. No denial, no lawsuit, just the cold, dead silence of guilt. The political fallout on Capitol Hill was swift and brutal. 3 Republican members of the Judiciary Committee, who had sat in stony silence throughout the latter half of the hearing, issued a joint statement demanding that Senator Van Hollen recuse himself from all committee activities pending a full ethics investigation. It was a stunning act of political patricide. His own party was cutting him loose, desperate to cauterize the wound before the infection spread. His chief of staff, the same aide who had worked with Michael Renner, resigned via an email sent at 3 a.m. The subject line was simply, resignation. And through it all, the 2 architects of the earthquake remained out of sight. Pam Bondi issued no statement. She gave no interviews. Her work was done. The facts were now their own advocates. JD Vance returned to Ohio. He didn't hold a press conference or a victory rally. He was photographed 2 days later at a local diner in Youngstown, sitting in a booth talking to a table of retired factory workers. He was listening, not speaking. The system hadn't collapsed. It had cracked. And through those cracks, for the first time in a long time, a little bit of light was getting in. The people who had felt voiceless for so long had seen the powerful held to account, not by a complex legal process they couldn't understand, but by a man who spoke their language and fought their fight armed with the undeniable truth. The reckoning was real, and it was only just beginning. Weeks after the seismic hearing, the aftershocks were still reshaping the landscape of Washington. The world was focused on the grand narrative, the resignations, the impending indictments, the bipartisan bill, the Judicial Transparency Act that was now sailing through Congress with unstoppable momentum. Documentaries were being commissioned, books were being written, and the names of Vance, Bondi, and Renner were etched into the permanent record of American political history. But the real story, the one that mattered most, was not happening in the glare of the public spotlight. It was happening in a quiet, unassuming corner of a small recording studio tucked away behind a public policy forum in Georgetown. The room was Spartan, designed for sound, not spectacle. A young journalist, barely 30, sat across a simple table from Pam Bondi. The microphones were live, but the atmosphere was not that of an interview. It felt more like a confessional. The journalist was nervous but prepared. "Ms. Bondi," she began, her voice soft. "The entire world saw what you uncovered, but they didn't see the 11 months you spent in the dark digging through these records. They didn't see the pressure, the threats. Why did you keep going, even when it was clear that powerful people like Judge Renner, wanted you to stop?" Pam Bondi, who had been a figure of icy composure throughout the public ordeal, looked down at her folded hands for a long moment. When she looked up, the armor was gone. Her eyes held not the hardness of a prosecutor, but the deep, weary weight of someone who had carried the silence of others for too long. "There was a case years ago," she said, her voice calm, but each word infused with the gravity of a formative memory. "It wasn't in D.C., it wasn't federal, just a local courtroom in Florida. A young woman, 17 years old, brought forward a claim of abuse. Not against someone famous, not even someone rich, just someone connected." She paused, her gaze distant, lost in the memory. "The system did everything it could to bury her. They called her inconsistent. They said she had an attitude. Her own lawyer was told by the judge off the record that pursuing the case would complicate existing relationships." That phrase, existing relationships, it stuck with me. It's the polite way of saying, don't upset the people who matter. The journalist listened, captivated. This was the untold story, the human engine behind the legal machine. "We won that case," Bondi continued, a flicker of old fire in her eyes. "But we didn't win because the system worked. We won because that 17-year-old girl refused to be silenced. She had nothing left to lose, and she fought with the courage of the abandoned. I refused to let her fight alone." The journalist's voice was quieter now, filled with a new understanding. "And this everything you just did with Judge Dugan with Stonebridge, it was connected to that?" Bondi nodded slowly. "When I first saw the threads of this network, the undisclosed conflicts, the language being manipulated, the way complaints were being quietly closed, all I could see was that girl's face. I saw a system that had perfected the art of complicating existing relationships on a national scale. I saw how we as a society tell victims to speak up, but then we punish, sideline, and discredit the ones who actually do. Dim." She leaned forward slightly, her voice dropping to a near whisper, but gaining in intensity. "I didn't do this because I thought I'd win. I did it because I remembered what it felt like to be the only person in a room standing beside someone who had been told they didn't matter. I did it because someone had to choose the truth over the comfort of the fraternity. Someone had to lose their fear first." The room was utterly still. The mic captured her voice raw and unfiltered. This was not a politician or a prosecutor. This was a woman who understood the profound, crushing weight of institutional silence because she had once stood against it with nothing but the conviction of a single forgotten voice. "You didn't say much publicly after the hearing," the journalist noted. "Senator Vance became the face of it. Why?" Pam Bondi leaned back, a faint, sad smile on her lips. "Because fire is what gets the world's attention. But the light that remains after the fire, the one that allows you to see the path forward, that comes from the truth being allowed to stand on its own. When the truth finally speaks in full, the most honest thing you can do is let people sit with it, in silence." The journalist looked down at her notes, then set them aside. The questions she had prepared seemed trivial now. She had come seeking a political scoop, a behind-the-scenes look at a scandal. Instead, she had found its heart. She had found the quiet, unshakable principle that had fueled the entire revolution, that the fight for justice is never about the powerful. It is always and only about the promise you make to the powerless. The story did not end with the fall of powerful men. It didn't end with the convictions, the new laws, or the flurry of media attention. That was merely the closing of a chapter. The true legacy of the hearing. The revolution ignited by the fire of JD Vance and fueled by the ice of Pam Bondi was quieter, deeper, and far more enduring. It was an echo that refused to fade, reverberating not just in the halls of power, but in the classrooms, courtrooms, and conversations of a nation that had been forced to look in the mirror. In law schools from Georgetown to Berkeley, the curriculum began to change. The congressional judiciary hearing was no longer just a current event. It had become a core case study, a modern-day landmark on par with the great legal battles of the past. At Harvard Law, a new seminar was introduced, its title a direct reflection of the new reality: When Advocacy Meets Authority, the Vance-Bondi Hearings, and the Crisis of Institutional Trust. The first slide of the first lecture was a still image from the hearing, Vance fiery and defiant, pointing at the screen, with Bondi calm and resolute sitting behind him. Students didn't just take notes, they took sides. Debates erupted on campuses, not about whether the network was corrupt, but about how long the system had allowed itself to look away and what their own role would be in preventing it from happening again. For the first time in decades, judicial ethics wasn't a footnote. It was the headline. The cultural landscape shifted. The phrase existing relationships became a national shorthand for polite corruption. Make it look like precedent became a cynical joke in offices across the country, a meme for covering up mistakes. A major streaming platform announced a limited series titled The Folder, based on Bondi's meticulous behind-the-scenes investigation. She declined to consult, having already said everything she needed to say. But perhaps the most profound shift was in the small, unheralded acts of courage that began to ripple through the system. A junior clerk in a Chicago courthouse, noticing a financial discrepancy in a judge's disclosure, filed a formal complaint citing the testimony from the hearing. This time, his complaint wasn't buried. It was escalated within 24 hours. A paralegal in Atlanta, asked to destroy notes from an off-the-record meeting, refused and instead logged them with her supervisor, quoting Vance, "The silence is where the crime happens." The fear that had once enforced complicity was slowly being replaced by a new, emboldened sense of duty. The echo of the hearing had given them cover and courage. The story's real lesson was never about politics. It was about the two fundamental forces that shape human events: conviction and complicity. It was a stark reminder that institutions are not buildings of marble and wood. They are living things made of people, and they are only as strong and as moral as the individuals within them. It demonstrated that courage is not a single act of heroism, but a partnership between different forms of strength: the quiet, methodical pursuit of truth and the loud, passionate demand for accountability. In the end, what Vance and Bondi accomplished was not simply toppling a corrupt network. It was to hold up a mirror and force a nation to confront the reflection. They challenged the comfortable lie that civility is more important than truth, that stability is more valuable than justice, and that silence is a neutral act. The final scene of this chapter of American history is not in a courtroom or a legislative chamber. It is in the mind of a young law student sitting late at night in a university library, a textbook open before her. The textbook is new, and it contains a chapter on the hearings. She reads the final words spoken by Vance, but she hears the quiet conviction of Bondi behind them. She closes the book, looks out the window at the sleeping world, and understands the weight of the choice that now rests on her generation's shoulders. The story doesn't end with applause. It ends with a responsibility passed from those who dared to speak to those who now have the duty to listen and to act. The echo in the hallway was now a voice, and it was waiting for an answer.